Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. A quick reminder, support the broadcast. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, $5 a month, $50 a year or more. We do private weekly chats. We do members-only live calls with past podcast guests, and I do a roundup of the week's news and a brief commentary. As well, you can donate also through Buy Me a Coffee, Wise, Donor Box, and so forth. And you can also purchase a consultation to chat with me about anything you like. And do check out our sponsor for this month, which is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit. It happens every year. This year, it's going to be October 7th to the 11th. It's online only. It's for free. I've interviewed Mikkel on my old TNT radio program. I've been on his Expat Money show, and a lot of the headline speakers, they're great. They've been guests on this podcast: Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Luongo, Mark Faber. And basically what they'll be treating at the summit is internationalization, creating a plan B or C or D, getting a second or third or fourth passport, investing in international real estate, creating offshore communities, diversifying your finances, and so forth. So the link is in the description, expatmoneysummit.com. You do need to reserve your free ticket. And joining us is James Burling. He's Vice President for Legal Affairs at Pacific Legal Foundation in Sacramento. He's argued cases nationwide, including before the Supreme Court. He's spoken and written about property rights nationwide. And he's got a brand new book. I've got a digital version right here. It's about to be published. Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. And it's got a foreword by Senator Mike Lee. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, James.
Hey, it's great to be with you today.
As I mentioned, I've been reading your book. I very much enjoy it. I've been mentioning the issue that you treat, which is that of housing, how it's become unaffordable, the overreach of the government. And so it's actually great for the first time on the podcast to treat this topic in depth with an expert such as yourself. But before getting into the book, if you want to tell us a little bit about Pacific Legal Foundation.
Well, sure. Pacific Legal Foundation is a nonprofit public interest law firm. It's been in existence for 50 years now, 51 actually. And we represent people for free in fighting government abuse, whether it's overregulation of property, whether it's attempt to have government-sponsored discrimination, whether it is environmental regulations run amok. We represent the little guy who cannot otherwise represent him or herself. We do it for free. And our goal is to set precedents in the court that can make a difference, that can ease up regulations for a vast number of people. We have won 18 of our last 20 cases before the United States Supreme Court. So we're on something of a roll there. And we like to think that we're making a difference of making lives a little more free for people across the nation.
You're doing great work, and I checked out your website, the Twitter X feed. You've been featured in a number of stories on places such as Reason.com, fighting this crazy government tyranny. And so basically the problem you talk about, this has been, as I mentioned, something on my mind. Housing has become unaffordable basically for the average person, and not just in America. I'm down here in Mexico, in the Western world, in Europe. I'm also a Croatian, and I just see it across the board. And you write that the disparity between the opportunities and conditions in foreign lands and those at home in America is no longer as stark as it was when the Statue of Liberty first stood as a beacon for the world's poor and huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And that it's becoming increasingly difficult for poor and middle-class families to find decent housing at an affordable level. You say Americans fall into two categories, those with homes and those without. Neither is doing well. And you've also said that even your adult, hardworking children with good jobs can no longer afford to buy the housing that you could at a younger age, especially in coastal regions like Southern California. I could probably say the same thing for my parents. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, which is one of the worst places as well, after reading your book. And so if you want to tell us about the current situation, problem, and why you wrote the book.
So I've been litigating property right issues for 40 years. And there's a common denominator that I find to these cases, and that is government overreach is preventing people from using property in the way they would like to use it. And this is especially having an impact on housing and the ability to build homes that Americans need to live in. we have not figured out a way, not in California, not in Venezuela, not in North Korea, to overturn the law of supply and demand. And by limiting the supply of housing through all kinds of restrictions, whether it's excessive zoning restrictions, excessive environmental laws, or just the sort of litigation abuse that goes on if you try to develop property. All of these things combined limit the supply of housing, and yet demand is still very strong. People need a place to live. I mean, you talk about my kids, and my kids, they need houses just like I needed houses when I was in my 20s and 30s. I needed a place to live. Eventually, starting with a small place and eventually a nicer place as you get older. But this is not the trend that's available to young people anymore. It's not what's available to a lot of the working class Americans, the people that are trying hard to earn a living, working in a Kmart or something like that. Rents for many, many people, working class people, have just gotten exorbitant as well because there's such a shortage of supply. And so my book tackles the various lawsuits, the various cases and trends over the years that have all contributed together to this mess of having housing just too expensive, too unaffordable, and too unavailable.
And I'm in a position where I can sort of compare now. I've expatriated to Mexico. I've become a Mexican citizen, and I can compare. And we still, housing, it's the market here, they're building like crazy, and it is getting much more expensive there, but there are much less regulations as far as I can tell. My property tax here is $100 a year in the States. Average middle class can be 10,000 a year, which is crazy. And then all the other regulations and rules that you have in the US and less of that you have in places like here in Mexico. And you basically, one of the key issues you mentioned are it's this what do you call it? The managerial sort of state, the technocratic state, with its just expanse over the decades and century of regulation and zoning. And so the first part of your book, you look back at this history, this trajectory, which was steeped in racism initially with the zoning laws. You say, to put it simply, the influence of the early progressive movement was gaining momentum. You also say that we understand today that it is zoning that has helped confine the poor, minorities, and immigrants to often overcrowded inner cities, and so on and so forth. So if you want to tell us a bit about how it began and then how bad it's gotten.
So let me begin at the very beginning with the very first zoning law in America. It began in 1910 when George McMetchen was a Yale-educated attorney, and his schoolteacher wife decided to buy a home in a nice part of Baltimore called Utah Place. Within days of buying that home, local youth had taken rocks in their hands and thrown them at every window and broke every window in his house. Why? Because Utah Place was a white neighborhood, and George McMetchen and his family were all Black. And the white people of Baltimore thought this was part of what they called the Negro invasion of their nice areas. And they persuaded the city council in a party line vote, Democrats voting for, Republicans voting against, to institute the nation's first zoning law. And the zoning law essentially made it a crime for a Black person to buy a home and live in a home in a predominantly white area. And vice versa was a crime as well, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods. Now that zoning became very popular in the southern states and the states between the North and the South, the border states there. And eventually one of these laws made it to the Supreme Court when it was passed in Louisville, Kentucky. And the Supreme Court struck that down, saying that was a violation of an owner's property right to sell property or to sell a home to whomever that person wished. And therefore, the NAACP and a white businessman that brought challenge won at the Supreme Court. But shortly thereafter, other cities began to adopt what they call economic zoning. So you're not going to zone on the basis of race because that was unconstitutional, but you're going to zone on the basis of economics. And for example, New York City was one of the first major cities to adopt such a law. And it was designed to keep Jewish people from going into Fifth Avenue, where they wanted to set up garment shops. And so the law said, what kind of residences could be put in what places, what businesses would go here, and over here you might have apartments and so on and so forth. And it was designed to keep things separate. That also became very popular. And in Euclid, Ohio, in the early 1920s, there was a similar ordinance that it essentially said Euclid, Ohio, I should mention, is a suburb of Cleveland. And people in Euclid were concerned about the urbanization of Euclid, which is a little bucolic town. It didn't have much in the way of anything going on in it, although across the street from the town was the Cleveland Tractor Company. And so the town zoned pretty much the entire property, the entire town, into single-family residential homes. Now, an owner of some property across the street from the Cleveland Tractor Factory objected, said, look, I'm not going to put residences, nice homes across the street from the Cleveland Tractor Factory. This is for commercial. I should be able to put commercial here, maybe some apartments or whatever, but not single-family homes on large lots. And it eventually went into the courts. It was challenged. And the lower district court said something that would be considered appalling today. But the court said, look, it's a matter of judicial recognition that when poor people, when minorities and immigrants move into a neighborhood, the neighborhood just goes to hell. And we know this. But if the Supreme Court struck down the racial zoning law that I mentioned a few years ago, certainly economic zoning can't be struck down on similar grounds or can't be upheld on similar grounds. So the trial court struck it down, but the Supreme Court, it reversed. And that's because the people of Euclid, Ohio, the attorneys for Euclid, convinced the Supreme Court that if you were to allow apartment buildings in residential neighborhoods, it would be akin to a nuisance. Now, you have to understand that apartments at this time were those sort of places that immigrants lived in, that poorer people lived in, that working class people lived in. And the very well-to-do justices on the Supreme Court and many other Americans as well had really no use for the immigrants. Yeah, they worked in our factories, but we certainly don't want them living anywhere near us, is the way they thought. And so the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can ban apartments, you can ban multi-story family, because otherwise it would be a nuisance to let this sort of activity into a nice neighborhood. The Supreme Court called apartments parasites on the rest of the community. So the zoning law was upheld. This is in the early 1920s. And from then on, communities across America have zoned out the sort of housing that working class Americans could otherwise live in. You have areas that are all large lot, single family residential. And by large lot, I mean more than an acre. Marin County, California, has more cows than people. And there are areas there that the minimum lot size is 160 acres for a single house. So how are you going to build enough housing for working class people to live in when you have a great majority of available land in America only open for larger lot single family homes? The answer is you can't. Therefore, you have the shortages that we are experiencing today, and therefore prices are rising and people are getting priced out of anywhere they could live, which is the whole point of my book, Nowhere to Live, that all these trends make it just impossible for people to find a good place a good and affordable place to live.
And that's one of the first things as I got older, went to university, get a job. It's like the most basic thing, and it just helps you so much. Like I used to pay rent here in Mexico every month, and now I just pay $100 a year for the property tax and the community fee, and you save so much money if you're able to own versus renting. And that's in another section of your book. You talk about how where there are greater zoning laws in different states, that dramatically increases the cost of housing 10, 20, 30, 40%, and basically forces people to rent and just live on the edge. You also talk about in your book how the environment is used as a pretext for control. You talk about wetlands, carbon neutral homes. Could you tell us a bit more?
All these things add dramatically to the expense of homes. I mean, in California, we have a requirement that every new roof has to have solar on it. Well, that's 10 grand a house. In California, we have requirements that every new house has to pay into fees for school, for traffic, for mitigation. It's somewhere between 20, depending on the community, and $156,000 per housing unit in California. We have cases that I talk about in my book where people have been trying to build subdivisions for over 20 years. There's an infamous case out of Southern California, north of LA, in some of the desert area. Tejon Ranch would like to build homes. It has over 220,000 acres. They've agreed now to give well over 90%, 95% of the property to the public in conservation, et cetera. And yet, even after they agreed to do that, in light of some lawsuits, they get sued again. They get sued by another environmental group. That case winds its way through and it begins to settle. And then an Indian tribe comes in and sues over cultural resources. As that case goes through, another lawsuit's filed. And this has been going on 20 years with this lawsuit whack-a-mole. And the judges that stop the projects because there's a lawsuit been filed have no conception that time is money. When you have a project that takes over 20 years to build, every house has got to be more expensive to cover all the costs of carrying this property for all these years. And yet, people don't understand that these delays are expensive and they go into creating housing that nobody can afford. So we have so many rules and regulations across the country. You talk about environmental regulations. You have vast areas of this country that were set aside as wetlands, which are pretty much undevelopable because you have to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers. And the Corps of Engineers was saying that you can't get a permit to develop wetlands if there are other lands you could build houses on. And so huge amounts of real estate were taken out of production. Now, to be sure, we had a case against the Corps of Engineers and the EPA. A few years ago, we went to the Supreme Court twice on this case, representing a small couple in Idaho who wanted to build on about a third of an acre lot. They wanted to build a little 3-bedroom house, and they were stymied for almost 20 years by the EPA because the EPA said there were wetlands on the property. We eventually got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said under a definition of wetlands that's compatible with the law and the Constitution, EPA doesn't have jurisdiction over their property, even if there were wetlands on it. And that's probably freed up tens of millions of acres for new development, but there's a lot more regulation where that came from. Endangered Species Act, we have huge areas of the country that are now part of critical habitat for various endangered species. You know, everything from the fauna that we all know and love, like grizzly bears, to little tiny weeds, to little tiny insects that live in the water, just all kinds of little things, which, yes, I understand that the environment's important. Everything is connected to everything else, but people are important too. And people's ability to live in homes is very important because what you have otherwise is people that cannot afford a place to live. I mean, that's the title of my book, Nowhere to Live. In the cover of my book, there are some tents, right? And that's, you know, emblematic of what we're seeing in city after city, of people living in tents on sidewalks, in front of businesses, in riverbeds, all kinds of places that when I was growing up, we never had this kind of homelessness crisis that we have today. And, you know, we are beginning to look like a third world country. No offense to third world countries, but we thought we had these issues solved, and yet we're creating them much worse for ourselves.
I was in the U.S. A number of times last year in Texas, and I was shocked to see just homeless people along the highway. And the crazy thing is, you don't even see that stuff in Mexico. Like, I had a Mexican friend of mine that went to California last year, and he was shocked to see. Like, imagine how bad it is when you have Mexicans saying, "Whoa, like we don't even have this in Mexico." I do want to ask you something you briefly allude to in the book. There's this trend. You know, a lot of people. We've listened to Davos World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, Great Reset stuff, and there's this idea now that's being picked up of resilient cities, sustainable, smart cities, or 15-minute cities. Where I live is actually officially a resilient city. And I'm seeing many countries now officially officially roll out these plans. Israel just last week released the first strategic plan where they're going to divide the country into 28 divisions and basically start working on these 15-minute cities. I've seen Canada do it now, Australia. And you write in your book, for example, you talk about purveyors of contemporary zoning declare that today's zoning is better than it used to be because it doesn't as rigidly segregate land uses in order to prevent apartments or commerce from invading residential areas. Planners and zoners call it smart growth because there are more mixed-use zones in some modern plans where apartments are again allowed to be built on top of ground-level retail stores. There's also more emphasis on the walkable developments where people are supposed to be able to walk to their jobs and shopping and so forth. And do you have any thought on this trend where they're trying to create these sort of smaller, smart cities?
Yeah, I mean, I have, after watching planners and studying what they've done for the last century, I have certain inherent skepticism that any kind of top-down planning is actually going to work and accomplish its goals, whatever those goals might be. I mean, it sounds really nice on paper to talk about smart zoning and to have, or smart growth, and to have, residences back on top of stores, the things that planners had banned years ago. They're admitting their mistakes. Maybe we shouldn't have banned them. But I would suggest that I would prefer to see the owners of the property be the first ones to make the decision of what makes economic sense for their property. Because when you try to shoehorn solutions into areas that may or may not fit, it's just not going to work. I have much more faith in the market being able to figure out what people need and what people want than have some planners who have gone to planning school but have really no experience in building themselves. And usually these are younger people that have very little experience in raising a family in a neighborhood and that kind of thing. And they don't know what the general population wants, and their money is not on the line. But the builder's going to have to figure out what people want and build for that. And if they figured it out wrong, they're not going to make money and they're going to do something else for their lives. Those builders who can understand what the market requires are the ones that are going to succeed. So, yeah, I mean, this idea of smart growth and resilient cities, it all sounds in some ways very nice, but it sounds very much the same, that planners get to decide what should be done with property and not the people who actually own that property and not the people who may or may not want to live near that property. So, I mean, kudos for recognizing they made mistakes, but please don't fall into the same trap of making new mistakes by just decreeing something different. You're still decreeing, and you're decreeing what may or may not be what people want or what they need.
In your book, you cover a lot more ground regarding other problems, and there are a lot of sad stories there as well. You talk about eminent domain, rent control, which is, again, it's common sense. If the expenses for the landlord just increase, but the rent stays the same, eventually they have to abandon the complex. I know many years ago, my parents owned in Chicago an apartment complex, and you talk about affordable housing mandates, and so what's we don't have time to cover all of that, but just what's one more sort of issue that is at the front of your mind that contributes to?
Yeah, rent control, which is now increasingly popular. We have a presidential candidate that has promised that she wants to have rent control nationwide to some degree, at least for corporate owners. And again, pretty much every economist that's looked at rent control knows it doesn't work. Just one example, St. Paul, Minnesota adopted rent control several years ago, allowing only a 3% increase per year on rental properties. What happened? There were development projects in place where people were building apartments and repurposing older areas and putting in residential housing. When rent control passed, they literally stopped immediately. The sticks and bricks were still sticking up in the air. They pulled off the equipment, pulled off the workers, and said, we're not going forward because of rent control. What rent control does, it may be a short-term panacea for the few people that are lucky enough to get into a rent-controlled apartment. But for everybody else, because there's such a disincentive now for building new homes and apartments with rent control, that the projects stop. The supply diminishes. Older rental apartments are taken off the market. They're either turned into condos or abandoned. There's a famous economist named Assar Lindbeck a number of years ago that said, look, next to bombing in a war, rent control is the most effective way of destroying a city. And there's a book published shortly thereafter by the Fraser Institute that took a series of pictures, some from Hiroshima, from Nagasaki, and then from the South Bronx, and some from Germany. And the caption was, is this destroyed city caused by bombing, or is it caused by rent control? And you couldn't tell until you looked in the back of the book for the answer. The obvious problem is when you can't recoup your investment on rental property. In New York City's law that was readopted in 2019 has made it impossible for recouping an investment of over 20 grand in upgrades in an apartment. You have a boiler that costs more than that, and you can't recoup that except over 20 years and only 20,000. So if you have $60,000 in repairs, the landlord has to eat it, and he can't make it up for rent increases. That's insane. That's a recipe to go back to the South Bronx era of the 60s and 70s, where buildings were abandoned, then burned down. Do we want that? That's what rent control gives us. And as I saw in my book, Nowhere to Live, I give example after example of bad government policies. I mean, we could talk all day about this, but I know the podcast is limited. But my prescription is to let government get out of the way and stop these bad laws and regulations. Allow builders to build the homes near where people want to live. Simple.
Yeah, and there was a great story as well featured in Reason talking. I think Pacific Legal Foundation was involved, and it dealt with a case where a woman had a $3,000 property tax, and the government just took her home, sold it for $100 grand, and kept the 98.
Kept the change, kept every penny of the change. Right.
Yeah, and I'm still it's almost like a feudal system. Like I said, in the U.S., you can end up paying anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a year for property taxes. Here in Mexico, it's like a couple $100. My other country of Croatia, it's no property tax. And so, are you optimistic going forward that the government will maybe start peeling back some of its layers of administrative control? Your thoughts on the future then?
I have to be optimistic. If I weren't, I wouldn't have written this book, which I hope will propel some of the discussion to do that. I mean, government doesn't like to reduce in size, and it rarely does. But if enough people realize that the problem is at the hands of government rules and regulations, maybe some people will begin to say the answer to the housing crisis, the answer to the people living on sidewalks and the streets, the answer is not more government programs and more government spending, but the answer is really less government control of all those things that go into the decisions of whether or not to build housing, less government control of the building of new homes where people want to live. And I think we have some hope. I have to have some hope, or I would just give up and maybe move next to you in Mexico.
And in your chapter 23, you get a little philosophical and historical. You talk about the idea of private property and basically how, it should be sacrosanct. I totally agree. Property, you talk about property and freedom, and basically it is freedom. And you also talk about the future of housing in the post-COVID AI world. And you mentioned Zoom as well, which is what we are using. And so if you have any other thought as well, any other final thought, and then if you want to tell us best places to get the book and your projects, Pacific Legal Foundation, and so forth.
Yeah, my final thoughts is that this is an issue that affects everybody, even if you own a home today. If you have children or grandchildren, the problem is theirs. If you're living anywhere near a city and you see the homeless on the streets, the problem is ours. It's our problem, and it's our fault for letting government get so much in the way of building new housing. My book does go into a lot of the details, a lot of stories. It's not written for attorneys, even though I am one. I like to write it for people who are, just people like you and me. Well, I'm an attorney, but you're not an attorney. And I like to think that this book will have an impact. You can find it. It comes out on Tuesday the 13th, but you can buy an advance copy at Amazon or any of the major booksellers. You can go onto our website, nowheretolive.org, to get your advanced copy, just look up Nowhere to Live on the Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis on Amazon, and you can find it there. And I hope this is a discussion that more and more people will begin to have on what we have to do to resolve the housing crisis, because it's something I certainly didn't grow up in. And I hope my kids and grandkids don't have to deal with this when they get to be my age as well.
Yeah, it's really it's getting bad, and for people viewing the podcast, just going to show it on screen here, the cover, Nowhere to Live, and you can get the digital version or the physical copy, and do check out as well. All the links are in the description. The Pacific Legal Foundation as well. They're doing a lot of good work fighting for the man on the street, the little man. Thank you, James, for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
It's been my pleasure talking with you.